Series, a project of the African Methodist Episcopal Church Publishing House focused on reducing the stigma of HIV in Black faith communities. And tonight we are delighted to be joined for our final workshop by Dr. Phillis Isabella Sheppard. Dr. Sheppard is the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Professor of Religion, Psychology, and Culture at Vanderbilt University Divinity School and the Graduate Department of Religion. And she serves as the Executive Director of the James Lawson Institute for the Research and Study of Nonviolent Movements, also at Vanderbilt. She has served in faculty and administrative positions at Vanderbilt, at Boston University, at North Park University, and the Center for Practical Theology, trained both in theology and ethics and pastoral care, widely published in Womanist Perspectives of Culture and Lived Religion, Pastoral Ethics, Gender and Sexuality, and Activism. Won't you join me tonight in welcoming Dr. Phillis Isabella Sheppard?
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very delighted to be with you this evening, and I'm most delighted because it does my heart good to know that that the Black church and Black churches in particular are responding to this need, especially when we think about the rates of HIV positive for folks in our communities. So I'm delighted to be here. And with that, I'll begin to share my screen. Sorry about that. Let me play from the start. All right. Pastoral care and the trauma of silence. So some of what I'll be talking about this evening is focused around silence. And you've probably heard this from other workshop leaders and pastoral presentations, and that is silence is death dealing. And so just the very notion of this gathering and this focus directs our attention to breaking silence and breaking silences, because there are multiple kinds of silences that we'll touch on in this workshop. So one of the things we think about when we think about pastoral care and pastoral responses is, how do we build community? How do we, as I said before, how do we begin to dismantle the kinds of silences around HIV and AIDS that keep people silent about not just their status, but their overall life? Because you already know and know from experience, not related to healthcare, when you begin to sequester off certain dimensions of your life, it grows, so that even in a faith community, you wind up only bringing a small portion. And the church accepts that small portion as you. I, in reflecting on this, thought about, of course, we need to know so when we decide to offer pastoral care around HIV and AIDS, what is our vision for it? Why are we doing this? Why are we offering any pastoral care? We need a vision. And that vision needs to come out of knowledge. And when I say knowledge, I mean the knowledge that comes from listening to a wide diversity of voices, not just folks who are considered experts on something, but to listen to the everyday experiences of individuals, families, partners, community members. And that shapes a vision for how, when we think about pastoral care with folks who are HIV positive, that we think about it as a pastoral care of the whole community, The other narrative, I guess I would say, that from a biblical source that struck me was the story between Nathan and David. You'll recall that Nathan came to David and told him about a man who acted unjustly, stole someone's property, did all these horrible things. And David, in self-righteous anger, recognized that it is wrong. And he said, the man should be punished even unto death. And Nathan said, "You are the man." And why does that narrative resonate for me as we think about this? And that is, the way I think about it is, somebody needs to tell us who we are and who we need to become. Someone needs to tell us, and that's us, who we are, because we have narratives about ourselves. We have narratives about the Black church, what it is, what it does, how welcoming it is. And someone needs to tell us who it is we need to become. And I'm using someone, somebody. We need to have this emerge. And obviously, this series is a part of that, telling us who we are and who we need to become. And some of who we need to become, I think, is based on ignorance and a lack of I used activism, a lack of activism as religious leaders on this issue. So that means, what I mean by that is that we need to combine our understanding of ourselves as religious leaders and our understanding of ourselves as pastoral leaders and community leaders. Again, back to the vision. What is our vision of the church of the future? And I'm going to ask you to just think about that. In light of HIV, what is your vision of the future? What is your vision of the future? And if you have paper and pencil, just jot down some words. Obviously, you're not going to be saying them out loud just yet, but what does the reality of HIV in the world, among people that we call brother, sister, mother, cousin, pastor, how does it shape our vision of the future? So just take a minute, jot those down. I suspect that if you jotted down some things, somebody in the group is thinking, okay, maybe we need pastoral care, and maybe we need to look at silences. But how do we do that for our context? And I'm going to say, as I have here, that we need to think about two things: culturally specific care, and that is a direct line to looking at the history and reality of how there are silences in many churches around sexuality and spirituality, sexuality and the church. So what would that mean for culturally specific care? First of all, I think it means that we ask ourselves the question, how has health and health care specifically affected Black folks? How have issues around health and healthcare specifically affected Black folks? And historically, based on your experience, think about this: how have Black churches responded to those healthcare issues? So what comes to my mind, of course, is there's a significant push in more recently in research and in reaching out to Black churches around, of course, issues around blood pressure, issues around healthcare issues related to dementia, healthcare issues related to reproductive health, as it relates to the ways in which, in particular, Black women die at a higher rate than every other ethnic group in childcare, giving birth. Okay, so that means we do the historical piece, we do the statistic piece, and now we have to ask ourselves, okay, how is it that HIV there has been so much silence that corresponds to much of the silence around sexuality in general in our church settings? You've probably heard or read a number of things that talk about the ways in which sexuality, just being sexual people, has been used against Black men and women. Either we're hypersexual, we're abnormal, all of that, which I don't think it's as far stretched to say that because of the history of HIV in this country, those silences linked such that HIV as a health concern became conflated as a sexuality concern and a moral concern in an asymmetrical relationship to speaking, health, and active responses. Active responses. I would ask you to think about, when was the first time you heard sexuality discussed in your church in a health-filled way, as opposed to a negative way? And when was the first time you heard HIV discussed? And I'm reminded of the first time I did a workshop in a Black church on HIV status and the church's response, that I was met with a great deal of, on the one side, anxiety, and on the other side, anger. The pastor was committed to having me come and do a workshop. And people showed up because the pastor said it was important, but there was a great deal of anxiety and anger that this had to be happening in a Black church, which somehow this group sort of saw both sexuality and HIV status as something we wanted to keep out of the church, as if it somehow tainted the spiritual dimension of being a spiritual community. So I ask you again, think about how you have heard about HIV discussed in your context, and see if there are connections between how sexuality is discussed. When I met with this same church for the second, this was a 4-part series, the second time, we actually basically started all over again with a little bit of movement. By the time we met the 4th time, what we were supposed to do in that session is sort of review what we had talked about, review what their hopes were for their community, and come up with a plan where, rather than just the leadership talking about this, that somehow it would be made available to the whole congregation, that this would begin a series of discussions. And I have to say that this particular group never reached that planning stage because they couldn't get past the silences that were a part of the church life together. They could not imagine that they could actually bring this up and sustain a conversation. In other words, they didn't think they could manage the emotional dimension of talking about HIV status, talking about sexuality, and linking all this with spirituality. Fear, 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 fear. We still forget that there is fear within people about letting everybody else know that they have AIDS because of the stigma that has gone with this disease. There's fear, and that hinders any of us from doing exactly what we need to do in the community. Fear. Now, let me make a distinction between fear and anxiety. Anxiety is that sort of unsettled feeling that something could go awry. When it gets to the point that that unsettling feeling dictates choices, it's fear. And people generally have fear because there's some element of reality to what they're fearing. So on the one hand, we have folks who are afraid to let people know their HIV status because the stigma of which they're speaking, that they'll be stigmatized, what that means is that they will be ostracized, that they will be left to manage their own life, whether it be the everyday realities of life, but also the spiritual dimension and the affective dimension. So imagine that you have the status that you're working with your physician with, that your family to some degree, and you want to be able, as with any other status in life, to be able to talk about it with your faith community and to meet distancing, fear, subtle and overt calls to be silent about this. Over a period of time, what we know would happen is, as the Philadelphia faith leader said, it hinders folks from talking, but it also means that some leave the community. For some, that means they leave religious context totally, because they, from what they've experienced and what they've learned, religion and who they are don't have a place together. They're ostracized. They're set apart from the community. And one of the things I like to say in my classes is, when we see this happening with a group and an individual, it's not just in their head. There are dynamics that are setting it in place. So for instance, one of the dynamics is, if you spend once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week with a faith community, and you hear everybody's prayers and concerns, and nothing ever is said about HIV status, nothing is said about pushing our medical establishment to focus on the care and concerns of Black individuals, families, and communities. Never hear that. That is a clear message that that doesn't belong in the life, or in the prayer life, or the liturgical life of the community. So when I say fear, we're not just talking about a small, minute fear. It is almost that sort of what's called an existential fear, that in this community, I actually don't exist. Because if we can only bring a small part of who we are and what we're dealing with to the community, we're there, little by little, we're being disintegrated, we're being pulled apart. So that's a fear that borders on terror. That's a fear that borders on terror. And you're caught between a rock and a hard place, to be a part of the community and be silent, to be ostracized in the community or from afar and be left alone. And be left alone. What do we need to do? What do we need to do? I'm going to ask you just to sit with that a minute. I'm going to ask you to breathe in, just very briefly, very quickly. I want you to breathe in fear. Breathe in fear. What does that feel like? what does it bring to mind? I want you to exhale fear. I imagine some of you, when I said breathe in fear, probably held your breath and said, I'm not breathing that in. Nobody wants to breathe that in. Nobody wants to inhale a big gulp of oxygen tainted with fear and exclusion. But if we were to breathe, inhale fear, inhale stigma, and inhale ostracism, we might begin on a deep and consistent level. We might begin to know what it is we have to undo, what it is we have to dismantle in our communities of faith. We should be asking ourselves, of course, if we breathe in all three of those and we exhale them, we do that 3 times and exhale them, who would we begin to face? So when I say who would we begin to face, I don't necessarily mean a particular person. I mean, who do we imagine would be at the Eucharistic table with us if we exhaled all of that and expanded who we understand ourselves to be as community and who we desire to be as community? What would this require of us? And let me just say at this point, the very conversations that you all are having reveals that you've said to yourself on some level collectively, you're wrestling with this question: what does the reality of HIV positive individuals in our broadest communities demand of us? You're wrestling with the ethical question of what does pastoral care mean? What does community care mean when we wrestle with the ethical dimensions? Because we are gathered here not because we're solely interested in the statistical medical, but we're all medical concerns, but because we feel the ethical pull to respond from an effective, caring, inclusive pastoral position. So if there are ethical pulls, if there are ethical demands, that means that inhaling and exhaling expands us to know that this is not an option. This is a part of our baptism, which calls us into community. This is part of what it means to be a person of faith, that we ask, what do the realities of life demand of us collectively and individually? What do the realities of life? It also calls on us to engage in the kind of reflection that says, what have we done and where do we need to go? And what hinders us? What hinders us? And if we don't think we're hindered, I'm thinking of another church that I worked with where, and this was an open and affirming church that certainly said things about HIV and said things about we want everyone to be included, but they also said things in the context of our workshops. They didn't want people to think, and I'm quoting, that we're an HIV church, like everybody who's HIV positive comes here. And so we talked about that. Why not? Why is that a fear? What kind of church do you want people to say you are? If not those who've been excluded, this goes back to What is your vision? And it adds to it, what is our identity? What is our identity as a faith community, such that our doors are either open, partially closed, or absolutely closed? And those kinds of questions make us ask, what do we need to do as a community? Black people living with HIV are often confronted with discrimination connected to stigma and misinformation in public places of importance within our community. That means, obviously, in our religious communities, in our education communities, and I don't just mean higher ed, but K through 12 and above. The barbershop is a sacred social place where Black Americans debate social, cultural, and political ideas. HIV discrimination destroys those safe places. Imagine, if you need to, what it would mean that you're afraid to go to the barbershop, either because you will not be invited to sit in the chair, or because you have learned in some way that once you leave the chair, you are the topic of consideration. What are the other sacred social spaces that you know about or can imagine becoming closed off? What are the places? We all know that in spite of the education that medical professionals receive, folks with HIV positive status are often denied basic dental care at certain places, counseling for any mental health issues, and certainly we know denied the sacraments in some places, like, for instance, at least out of my tradition, the sacrament of marriage. When social sacred spaces are denied to anyone, again, that means that enforces silence. That increases the experience of being stigmatized and being excluded. Think about our public places of importance. Think about how have you noticed in public places, either A, that there's an openness, there's an expansiveness to talk about HIV, a place to be educated around HIV concerns, and just the opposite. How are silences enforced, sustained in our public, social, sacred spaces? And ask yourself, where are you in those dynamics? How do you step in and out, most likely, of those dynamics that both exclude and begin to invite? Take a minute to reflect on that, jot down some notes. Oppressive spiritual language. AIDS is still viewed by some as God's given purge. We don't have to turn on the news to hear this, but we do hear it. We hear it on the news. We hear it within faith communities. we hear it on the street. To cleanse a community of an unwelcome population. I would like to say that that's not as true as it used to be. Make a mistake and go into the wrong faith community, and you will hear it again and again. And one of the things that has long been unsettling, shocking, surprising is the way in which negative feelings around HIV status, sexism, and homophobia flow back and forth without interruption. When I was doing some earlier research, not related to HIV status, it was about Black women's experience in church and society. And I would go visit various churches and just participate, but also observe. I was absolutely dumbfounded by how often sexism and homophobia and HIV status would become linked in some kind of joke that a preacher or a pastor was telling. And even folks sitting in the pews that I knew to be HIV positive would laugh with the rest of the congregation. Sometimes, there would be shared anxious laughter, but clearly, or at least my interpretation was, to not laugh would expose people in some way. And because the collective shared in the joke, that meant speaking up was harder, but it also meant that this disrespect became linked with the very spiritual experience of being in that community, almost inextricably, like interwoven together, that homophobia, HIV, sexism were so linked that to be spiritual in some of those communities, you had to engage this way. You had to engage in this way. As I think about that particular project and that research, I am still shaken by the way in which not just individuals, but whole communities can be led to respond in ways that are violent spiritually, violent psychically, and violent to the collective. It undoes, it not only oppresses, but it undoes the potential that religious language, that religious experience can have as both a support and as a point from which one advocates for the health and caring of everyone in the community. I often come back to this quote. Martin Luther King said, "There comes a time where silence is betrayal." That's from Reverend Charles McWells out of LA. There comes a time, King said, there comes a time where silence is betrayal. Reverend McWells says, for far too long, the Black church has been silent about HIV/AIDS, and that is unforgivable and has to change. I want you to reflect on that claim. It is unforgivable. What makes it unforgivable? For now, I'd ask you not to argue with the claim, but what makes it unforgivable? What makes it unforgivable? Reverend McWells would say we have a moral, ethical, and spiritual obligation to speak out, to support and to embrace people who are at risk for and who are living with HIV status and AIDS. Silence is not an option. It seems to me that what would make him say that is unforgivable is because it is death dealing. That's one, it is death dealing. Number two, basically, silence that is betrayal denies that those living with HIV positive status do not fall under the theological notion that we are all created in the image of God. It means that there's a theology embedded in the response that suggests some are closer to being in the image of God than others. As if there's a hierarchy of being created in the image of God, or as if one can be created or born in the image of God and lose it. So in our pastoral responses, one of the things we're doing, whether it's in our homilies, our sermons, our Bible studies, much of our work centers on undoing that very idea that one is not created in the image of God, and two, that somehow one, if you were created in the image of God, that you can lose it. Theologically, that's not tenable, and pastorally, it's not tenable. So to quote Reverend Mick Wells again, this is a moral, ethical, and spiritual obligation, but it comes to the heart of our call to respond pastorally. And by this, I don't mean just the pastor. I mean that we all have this call to respond pastorally and to respond in ways that mirror to people that they are created in the image of God, and to dismantle those forces and systems that deny that to individuals. And finally, he would say to embrace people who are at risk. To embrace. Think about your contacts. Think about your particular congregation, your site of ministry. What would it mean to embrace people who are at risk and who are living with HIV positive status or AIDS? What would it mean? What would it demand of the whole community? Imagine yourself going back to your community and asking, what is our moral, ethical, and spiritual obligation? What do you imagine would emerge in the conversations, both in the gathering and what I like to call the sidebar conversations? What happens, the meeting after the meeting, the gathering after the gathering, the religious talk after the prayer talk. So partly what this means is that pastoral care always is about ethical, liberating responses that recognize also understand that there's a dismantling of those forces that seek to deny people's humanity. We don't get to do one side and not the other side. And how do we collectively dismantle within our congregation and beyond those systems that enforce silence, that rather than embrace, reject? And how do we call the community into the kind of conversation where not only do we speak out, but speak truth to one another, where we have the kind of transparency that can hold where we've been and where we need to go. Where we've been and where we need to go. How do we do that slow, hard work? We know that we do it first by acknowledging that we haven't done it so far, that we recognize we have an obligation that is moral, ethical, and spiritual to respond either differently, more fully, and in a more sustained way. Some might say, to some degree, the language that we as a community confess the ways in which we have not lived up to the best of who we say we are, and that we collectively will endeavor to become who it is we need to be. Religious and spiritual leaders as resources. What is the real hindrance? After my nearly 30 years working in and for people with AIDS, I suggest it is and continues to be stigma. Reverend Yvette Flunder. As fearful as some are about the Ebola epidemic, Ebola does not have attached to it the stigma that the AIDS epidemic has had attached to it. When the stigmatism ends, so will the epidemic. I want to say that as pastoral and religious leaders, we have a responsibility to actually understand the ways in which stigmatism is intertwined in so much of what we do, so much of what we say. I would invite you to take a minute and imagine you were going to pray in a way that was embracing, in a way that calls into community all, and that recognizes that we are all created in the image of God and cannot lose it. If someone asks you, could you write a prayer that holds all that? What kind of language would you use? Where would you draw on that language? I suspect one of the things that we'd have to do collectively is to get rid of the language of God is, but everyone is, but. We have to clear that out and start over again and again. Language that invites, language that mirrors, that talks about, that declares assertively, we are all created in the image of God. We cannot lose that. That this community is a community for everyone. So what characterizes, characterizes careful care? My husband and I wish to express our appreciation for your visits, prayers, and sincere concern for us and John. I know John didn't want to die. Part of it was because he was afraid. You reassured him when you reaffirmed what he had been taught as a child. John felt he must be a terrible person because he had this disease and was dying at a young age. John and his dad loved each other. but John didn't receive the love he wanted from his dad. My husband knew John was gay, but didn't tell him he knew. And John was a nervous wreck around his dad. He felt his father would reject him if he knew. That is the reason he didn't know about John's illness. This is an old quote from the Christian Century, 1987. And what you hear in this quote, we would now say are a lot of assumptions and truth that remains. The truth that remains is that visits, prayers, sincere concern. People need that regardless of what stage of life they're in. Reassurance, reaffirmation, love. In 1987, John Purdy was writing about gay men who were dying of AIDS-related illnesses and the family dynamics that interfered with family being together until the end. Secrecy. John knew he was gay. My husband knew John was gay, but didn't tell him he knew, which meant keeping them apart. Of course, there are a lot of assumptions, we would now say in this quote. One, John Purdy was focusing on gay men, and we know that women, Black women in particular, represent 58% of those who test positive for HIV today, of new cases. We know that the HIV cases among young people is, in our communities, increasing in numbers. I say this, and the way I want us to think about this quotation is that care means that we have to, careful care means that we have to undo who we think is at the heart of the concern. If we think that adults are afraid to tell the faith community about their HIV status, imagine if you are 16 or 17, 20. Careful care means imagining everyone in this circle, imagining everyone in this circle. We don't often hear today much about a theology of love with action. Every now and then we'll hear it. But I think if we go back to what we've talked about so far, what you've written down, our breathing in and exhaling, what we're really talking about, when we take it seriously that everyone is created in the image of God, and that has ethical and moral and spiritual dimensions that we're obligated to respond to, we're talking about love with action. We're talking about being reconciled. And here I say the church must be reconciled to those they've excluded, ignored, and denied the fullness of their humanity. What I mean by that is that the church has work to do. It's this way, the reaching out. And why do we do that? Because we need to be reconciled with the whole community, the whole of who we are. Those we've denied their existence of and their fullness of their humanity. And that comes in increasing places for belonging and increasing action on our part for advocacy. Advocacy. It is not enough, they're in the popular culture, we might say, Instagram world, TikTok world. There have been all these sort of jokes around thoughts and prayers. something horrible will happen and some important official will say, we send our thoughts and prayers. It is not enough for us to send thoughts and prayers. It is not enough for us to pray. It is not enough for us even to create spaces of belonging. There has to be advocacy, love with action that comes with it. Otherwise, so I have these two squarish things. Otherwise, the point at which we stop bringing love, belonging, and advocacy together, we create pockets, crevices where silence rules. We treat some Black bodies as suspect and even expendable. We also know that churches, like everyone else, we put our money where our mouth is. The economic costs are elevated over human life. In other words, suddenly we hear language, we can't afford this, we can't afford that. That says something about what we think about humanity, or at least some people's humanity. If we don't connect love, belonging, and advocacy, it's always going to be about them over there, othering. Like it or not, in order to other, we have to engage in a process of misinformation. So a theology of love is undoing misinformation. Undoing misinformation. We begin to undo misinformation because in our work around advocacy, we too become more informed. The opposite of love with action, belonging, and advocacy is a lack of life-saving pastoral, religious, and spiritual care, discourse, talk, action. So we have to show up. I would say we have to show up just where nobody expects us to show up, dismantle silence. I once gave a class an assignment, and it was around HIV, and I said, every place they went over the neck between the two classes, they were supposed to bring up something about HIV in every conversation, just make it fit in there, and come back and say what that was like. What that was like. For some, it was, for many, it was very uncomfortable. One person said, I'm afraid that people will think I'm HIV positive. I don't want people to think that. Okay, you don't want people to think that? Think about why. Of course, it goes back to stigma. It goes back to fear and terror. We show up, we undo stigma, we visit people that we say we care about. We reaffirm that each and every person is created in the image of God. We remember that individuals live not in a vacuum, but live in communal, familial, friendship contexts. We try to make those connections so that no one is left on their own. We demonstrate to everyone that they have access to God's ear, grace, and concern, that prayer, that language, that communication with the divine is open and available to all. We acknowledge fears, around death, rejection, and guilt. These are feelings not the predictor of the future. In other words, I'm saying in pastoral care, on the one hand, we recognize that we don't know the future, but we come together to hold each other's fears of death, rejection, and guilt. We hold them so that those where they need to be dismantled, we are there. Fear is a horrible thing to manage alone. We acknowledge that the church may have closed doors, remind everyone that the church in its fullness is where the doors and hearts of the people are open. And that is not a one-time thing. I think we all can talk about places that have, how shall I say it, seem to have been open to conversation, open to action, etc., and there's a change maybe in pastoral leadership, and that has to be reworked again and again. So it's not that we reach this stage where, yes, we are in the right spot. No, we reach the stage where we are committed to continually showing up, that we continually are articulating that we're created in the image of God, that we're committed. We continually remind us that we need to be informed, we need to be educated, and we need to be a voice of spiritual support and public support. So as pastors, we need to be informed about the resources. You know, if a family shows up, an individual shows up, and we don't have any sense of what resources are available, our pastoral care becomes relegated to thoughts and prayers. And finally, we don't send people off. We don't like name resources and send them off. No, we stay involved. We stay involved. There's a reason that people come to us. And it's the combination of that we will show up, we will be active, we will be educated and informed, but we will stick around. And I'm going to stop there for questions.
Ooh, I invite you all to do as Dr. Sheppard has invited us earlier, and to just take a breath and breathe in all that was shared, and to take stock of what emotions and what thoughts might be swirling around inside of you. Just sit with them for a moment. Dr. Sheppard, thank you for a very rich and generative workshop. I think it will leave a lasting impression upon us for days to come, and hopefully lead us into some more direct and specific action. I want to blend a few of the questions that we've kind of gathered from some of our partner congregations with some of the direct things you shared in your workshop. I think I've synthesized them into 3 questions. The first is hearing you talk about the fear, first, the difference between fear and anxiety, but how that shows up for the individual. What are the ways that we can also examine more directly how that shows up for the institutions, how that shows up for a church? And what are ways that a church, a congregation, might be able to get under the causes of their own silence?
I think that's a great question. So I think the first way that anxiety shows up for the church, the collective body, is that when HIV or AIDS is brought up, some people immediately have reasons why we can't do it. Now, the one that is quite striking, in some communities, the liturgical year is very important. And so I've heard people say, well, it's not the right time of the liturgical year. And whatever time this is brought forward, the liturgical year is waiting for this liberative conversation, this movement. So that's one way it shows up. You know, in another line of work, we might say that's resistance. I think, you know, pastorally and theologically, we can say that it's representative of anxiety, and that our role as pastoral leaders is to say what I just said. The liturgical year is waiting for us to bring forward the path of liberation at every point in the liturgical year. And then, of course, it's once we say something like that, that doesn't mean that anxiety dissipates. We've got to come up with ways that the liturgical year for the specific context does exactly do that. An example I can think of, and this was many years ago, there had been a police shooting, and it was just before Easter. And there really were people who didn't want to talk about it in church because it was just before Easter. And of course, the pastor made the claim that we're talking about the cross, we're talking about murder, right? It's made for this conversation. The whole, again, I know I'm repeating myself, but I believe that we're not ruled by the liturgical year. The liturgical year invites us to deepen our spirituality, gives us a path for that, but we don't leave the outside realities. That's woven together. In other words, I guess another way to put it is we don't spiritualize the liturgical year. And I think it's perfectly healthy and good when those in religious leadership name anxiety ahead of the game. Like, I can imagine that we're going to have some anxiety. We're going to have different feelings and thoughts, and we're going to try to hold that. And then name some ways of being. I don't like to say ground rules because then people start checking off whether or not they've met the rule. But the way that we're going to try to approach this is the way we approach our liturgies, for instance, with respect, openness, etc., so that who we are as a community is constantly being interwoven with our approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful, particularly for, I think, a lot of our congregations who are very driven by the lectionary and by liturgy, and who might be tempted to use that as an escape.
Mm-hmm.
These next two questions build on the first, and they kind of move into a sequence. The second is connecting back to your portion of the presentation about casting a vision and thinking more intently about why are we doing this, and what is the church's responsibility. I'm wondering, what practically might you offer to congregations as they work toward a plan of theology of love with action? What are the steps that they can take to discern that vision, to clarify their goals, to really ground themselves in, once they perhaps get past the fear or the anxiety, how might they position themselves toward that theology of love?
Two things immediately come to mind. The one is asking, I like to say the congregation to tell the story of who are we? And that takes a little while because, in most congregations, most churches, people have a little bit of idealization who their church is. They might start off by saying, flaws just so that they look like, but eventually they come every Sunday. So they have an idealized vision of who we are. Now, in some contexts, what you would do is actually ask folks who haven't, either whether it's someone whose status is positive, or it doesn't even, might even say, well, let's ask the women, have they experienced all that? So you don't even have to go directly to it. So what you want to do then is to not dismantle that this is who we are, but to show that not everyone gets to experience all of this vision. Get that on the table, who we are, the discrepancy with it, and then asking the question and making sure it's a broad conversation. Who do we need to become? Get all that out, and you're going to get the wildest, big dream of who we need to become, when the answer might be, we just need to be more open and more honest. And, we can't, everything's impossible. You got to work with that a little. And from there, say, okay, this is who we thought we were. This is who we need to become. What are we called to do now? And then come up, so I like to come up with like a chart that says, let's name everything we think needs to happen. So you name that. Then the next thing you name is, when do we need to do this by? See, these are very safe movements at this point. And then the next column is, who's doing each one of these? How? And then the steps. The reason I like who, because one of the things you'll quickly hear is that the pastor should do this, the pastor should do this, it goes, and so that there's a little disruption that has to happen there. The pastor is the pastor, but we are a pastoral community. So just by having the process, you're already disrupting notions about how it's going to be done and who's going to do it. We are. So if they want to list the pastor for everything, that's fine. Who's going to partner with the pastor on this? Who's going to take the lead? So those kind of things. And what that does is, if there are grandiose ideas of what needs to be done, like too many things, then the next column is, let's prioritize these. Then you reset the dates. So that sounds like it's a very long process. It can be, but it also can occur over 6 to 8 weeks. And this is where I think leadership within the body is really important. For each of those tasks that you take on, like 4, then there needs to be someone who's good at a strategic plan. Coming up with, this is what we're going to do, and who's going to. So it should be, at that point, it has to be guided by prayerful consideration, the realities of the resources that are in that particular community, but it also needs a plan and someone who holds the plan. So when the group goes off wandering about something new, this is our plan, this is what we said we're going to do. If they come up with something totally unrelated, let's put this in a bucket that we come to after we've gotten this in motion. So no ideas get thrown out, but a lot might get in a bucket to come back to.
Sure. I think that's really helpful, particularly for all of our partner congregations, which are in, we targeted those cities where the rates of transmission are highest. So they're Atlanta, New Orleans, Dallas, the spaces where there is a lot of work to do, but perhaps can feel directionless if there's not a plan.
That's right. And so that's the point you just made is good, because the other thing that needs to happen, so each church needs to go through this, and then they need to find out what other churches are also grappling with this and coming up with plans. Not all parts of it have to stay in that one. In fact, they shouldn't. The reach would be much wider and probably more effective if the community can work that way. I mean, I know that there are sometimes impediments to that. So stay focused, but look for likely partners.
Your comments also lead me straight to the third question, some of which you've already spoken to. But as we think about the demands on the whole community in terms of the ethical and spiritual obligations, I was laughing as you were talking about the meeting after the meeting, because that's AMEs are very notable for that. What are the ways that the folks in the pews can assist in making a difference and not kind of relegating that expectation to just the pulpit? Particularly if there's resistance from the pulpit, but those who are gathered in the rest of the pastoral community have a vision or see work that needs to be done.
In my experience, sometimes there is resistance from the pulpit, but there's not a resistance from the community doing something. Like the pastor doesn't want his or her name to be attached to it. So that actually works quite well, in the sense that you do want the congregation to hold responsibility for this emerging vision. So I think what should happen, in an ideal world, what would happen is there would be a series of Bible study. Like, look at the structures that already exist in the church. You have Bible study. Either fit with the one exists, if pastor allows that. If pastor doesn't, have a Bible study of those who are interested and concerned. So think about the committees you have. I said to one church, well, could there be someone who infiltrates a committee, like the pastoral care committee? Have a pastoral care committee. What do I want to call it? It doesn't have to be an official committee. It can be based on people within the congregation. So those committees have people operate within the structures that exist until the structures reveal that they're too limited to hold the emerging vision. And that's when working with other churches is so crucial, because that's the point where sometimes the congregants give up. They're like, look, we tried to work with pastor, we tried to work with this committee, we've got this group. You definitely need to reach out.
And even to other social organizations.
Exactly. That's right. And that's a given. because
Right.
most of us don't have the kind of knowledge at our fingertips when we're starting this work to, yeah. And one of the things that I think really has to happen is that churches know what the numbers are, because people generally don't know the numbers. They think they're much lower than they are, much lower. And they still think it's relegated to particular communities and not understanding that this is a real health crisis. And it's one that's fueled by ignorance in many ways.
Absolutely. I want to end our time with returning to a quote you shared from Bishop Flunder, which is, "When the stigmatism ends, so will the epidemic."
Yes.
And so hopefully we can continue to commit the life of our, the work of our lives and of our churches to combating these stigmas as they show up in our churches, and following many of the ways that Dr. Sheppard has invited us today into how to practically do that as loving, caring, and life-giving people of faith. Thank you again, Dr. Sheppard, for joining us for this powerful workshop. For all previous episodes and for further resources, visit www.imame.org, where you can find all previous broadcasts there, as well as on Facebook Live and YouTube. Join us for our final broadcast on World AIDS Day, December 1st, for a closing service of word and worship. Until then, be well.